Warning, there's going to be a lot of spoilers for The Last of Us Part 2 in this video, but of course it's my personal opinion that you really shouldn't play this game if you enjoyed the first game. I really just recommend doing what I did and watching the cutscenes on YouTube, or just learning about the leaks and the spoilers online. If you liked the first game, mainly for the same reason I think most people like the first game, which was the interesting narrative and the compelling characters, then The Last of Us Part 2 is not a game that I would really recommend you picking up and playing. But you are free to do what you want. It's a free country. I'm just saying I personally would not recommend it. But either way, spoiler warning for the entire plot for The Last of Us Part 2, or at least some of the major plot points in the game. So if you care about that, then I would say maybe just avoid this video, because I'm going to be discussing that. Ellie's quest for revenge starts when she witnesses Joel's death by Abby beating him over the head with a golf club. The reason for this is, of course, as many people have already discussed, incredibly stupid because it's completely out of character for Joel, but let's not really focus on that. Let's just focus on Ellie's revenge quest in The Last of Us Part 2, and the game having this whole cycle of revenge theme, and how revenge is pointless, and it just turns you into a terrible person. I think, obviously, we know that's what they were trying to say with this game. However, throughout the course of the game, we don't really see Ellie go through any sort of substantial, like, character development or self-reflection because of this. We don't really get a lot of mention of Joel, or a lot of, like, really heavy focus on Ellie, you know, just being sad about his death or anything. It's mostly just her being angry. And that's fine, because that's part of the cycle of revenge. However, Ellie doesn't really ever seem to, you know, she doesn't really seem to be all that sad about just the fact that, you know, Joel is dead, because apparently in The Last of Us Part 2, they just try to make it out that Ellie is really pissed at Joel because of what he did in the first game, not really trying to understand the reason, you know, the deeper reason behind why he did what he did. And I just feel like this is, speaking of things being out of character, I feel this is very out of character for Ellie, because I just feel like the Ellie from the first game, while she would probably be mad, I think she would also eventually come to understand the reasons for why Joel did what he did, and that it was ultimately out of love for Ellie. So really, this is just something that I feel was really all the characters from the first game were basically just are not really anything like how they were in the first Last of Us. They've been completely changed in Last of Us Part 2 for, honestly, for worse. Ellie basically goes on this revenge quest to kill Abby, and Abby is another character that we don't really get a lot of substantial, like, character development or information about. And because of that, it's like, it's hard to really feel anything when these two characters confront each other, and when Ellie ultimately tries to get her revenge. We don't really know a lot about Abby, if she, like, really feels any sort of regret for beating Joel over the head with a golf club, if she ever really does a lot of self-reflection, realizes that she might be in the wrong, even though she was trying to get revenge for her father, who Joel killed. Okay, so I think I should also mention this. So the reason why Abby killed Joel is because Joel, one of the random NPC surgeons you kill at the end of the first game, happened to be Abby's father. This is just, it could work. A random NPC you killed that happened to be the father of an important character in the sequel could work. But the way it is handled is just, like everything else in the game, just really poor, and they don't really tell you much about this person who was her father, aside from, you know, he was her father, and she wants revenge on Joel after she learns that Joel killed him. And it's funny because there is an example from the other thing I want to compare this game to, which is the manga Vinland Saga, that I could bring up later, that has a lot of similarities to this as well. But I will not mention that yet. So the final confrontation happens between Abby and Ellie, and Ellie, even after having her fingers bitten off by Abby, and she lets her go. And the reason for this is because Ellie has a flashback of Joel playing the guitar. Now, you would think that this would actually make Ellie even more enraged and want Ellie to actually kill her, not let her go. This really does not make any sense, but regardless, Ellie lets her go, and supposedly she's going to be the protagonist in the third game. Ellie goes back to a ranch of somewhere where she lived, or she was living with her girlfriend Dina. She goes back to find everybody is gone, and she's by herself, and she starts playing the guitar. Now, I think, honestly, this kind of ending could have worked, because I see potential with it, like, where you're basically, like, left with nothing, and you're left kind of like a hollow shell of a person. However, it's really the way in which we got here that is the biggest issue with the story and the cycle of revenge thing. So, ultimately, I just feel like this game fails because Ellie, she doesn't get her revenge. She decides to let Abby go. And of course, like what I mentioned before, like, I think this could work, but you need to have a good justifiable reason for this to happen. And really, there is none. And especially after you've killed a beloved character who's the main character from the first game, you'd better have a damn good reason for doing this. And you'd better be able to flesh out Abby enough to where people can at least understand to an extent why she might have done what she did. But that's, of course, not the case here. So let's get to the other thing I want to compare Last of Us Part 2 to in terms of its theme of the cycle of revenge, and that is Vinland Saga. Now, there are many other things that I think could also have done the cycle of revenge better that I could compare this game to, but Vinland Saga is one that I think is a really good example. The main character, Thorfinn, has his father killed in front of him by the character of Askeladd, who becomes one of the antagonists in the story. But there is a big difference between the way in which Thorfinn's father Thors dies and the way in which Joel dies. Joel is surrounded and then beaten, shot in the knees, and beaten over the head with a golf club. Thors engages Askeladd in combat, and Askeladd respects Thor. You can see that there is a mutual respect between the two as warriors when they fight. Askeladd doesn't really try to do any, or at least that many, dirty, underhanded things for the most part in this fight, at least not until the very end. But you could see that there is a respect there between the two, and there's also a certain respect for Askeladd, you know, for Thors as a person, even though he has to kill him. And Askeladd isn't really killing Thors out of any sort of revenge. It's just because he was hired to do this. So it's just really a job to him, and he doesn't really hold any sort of personal animosity towards Thors. But of course, because Thorfinn sees this and sees his father be killed this way, he, after this point, decides to dedicate his entire life to try to kill Askeladd. However, because Thorfinn has some of the same warrior's pride that Thors had, he wants to engage Askeladd in a duel before he kills him. He's not going to do anything like try to kill him in his sleep. That's just not the kind of person that Thorfinn is. We see that Thorfinn's revenge just consumes him and makes him and turns him into this angry, murderous person who's just willing to kill anybody in order to get to Askeladd, or do anything to just to get the chance to duel Askeladd and kill him. Askeladd is actually a likable character despite being the person who murdered Thorfinn's father. He's a scoundrel, really. Like, he's just kind of someone who takes pleasure in causing mayhem and being a Viking. Like many of the other characters in this manga, they're also Vikings. Askeladd just takes pleasure in what he does, but you also learn later on that there's much more to Askeladd than we really knew in the beginning. Askeladd actually hates Vikings, and he's actually of English descent and supposedly is an ancestor to King Arthur. And he hates Vikings because his mother was mistreated or abused by her husband. She was basically just thrown out of the house, thrown out to live with the peasants and the slaves. And Askeladd is just a forgotten son of his Viking father. So this is why he really comes to hate Vikings, because of the abuse that his mother suffered at the hands of his father. Askeladd, after getting his father's attention and his father realizing that Askeladd is actually his son, he plots to kill his father, and it explains a lot as to why Askeladd is fairly callous about Thorfinn's father's death, and because he never really had that kind of connection with his. So you kind of come to understand to an extent why Askeladd is not all that sympathetic about Thorfinn wanting revenge for his father's death. But of course, when Thorfinn does try to get revenge for his father's death, that revenge is taken away from him by another character by the name of Canute. Canute ends up killing Askeladd in sort of a staged manner. Askeladd kind of had this in his plans all along. He wanted Canute to take the throne, and he wanted Canute to become the next king. So he kind of set this all up, and Thorfinn never really got the chance to actually kill Askeladd himself. And there is just, after this, it's just a beautiful scene in my opinion, where Thorfinn is just completely devastated. Like, you can see in his eyes, he's just lost everything. He's lost his will to live. He's lost everything he's been fighting for. It was taken away from him in an instant. And in the scene, Askeladd tells Thorfinn, there's more to life than just revenge. You know, you need to start living your life and not living it for the sake of revenge. And to me, that scene was just done perfectly. Because of course, after this whole beginning arc of the manga, because this was all just kind of like a prologue to what you know, the plot really is in Vinland Saga. After this, Thorfinn goes years living his life just kind of living this like as a hollow shell of a person, because his will to live and his goal in life has just kind of been taken away from him. So he only lives kind of as a machine after this point, not really so much as a person. So it's kind of sad to see, but then of course I feel like the arc that takes place after that is necessary, because Thorfinn eventually is reborn as someone who is who has a different purpose in life, and who acknowledges their past and wants to become better because of it. And I think that's just a great character arc. It's honestly one of the best character arcs I've seen, not just in manga, but in any fiction, which is also really not so much fiction, because technically Thorfinn is actually based on a real person. But of course, how much of what's in the manga is true and what's not true is probably up for debate. I was going to mention, in regards to the random NPC that gets killed that happens to be Abby's father in The Last of Us Part 2, there is somebody that Thorfinn killed when he was with Askeladd's band in Vinland Saga that ends up being the father of a character who joins Thorfinn's party later on in the manga. And she, of course, wants revenge for what Thorfinn did, and really it's a good way to kind of go back to this like cycle of revenge type of theme that the manga had in the first place, where this person just wants to kill Thorfinn, and Thorfinn needs to find a way to convince this person that he's a changed person. However, this is of course not easy, and this person is very angry, obviously, because Thorfinn killed her father. And it's not easy to try to find forgiveness, to get forgiveness from this person. And honestly, like, and this is the best part to me, like, technically Thorfinn is never forgiven for what he did. This person decides to join Thorfinn's party, but says, I'm going to be watching you, and if you ever fuck up, if you ever make a mistake, I will kill you. So it's really just kind of a temporary truce, if anything. It's not really, at least not yet to where I'm at in the manga, she has not really technically not forgiven him. So I think that makes perfect sense. You're not really going to be wanting to, you know, forgive someone who's killed somebody you love so quickly. And I really feel like this is something that should have happened with Abby and Joel. Joel should have been spared. Abby should have at least gone through basically made a similar deal with Joel. Basically that, I'm not sure how to feel about what you did yet. Let me, you know, you need to prove to me that you are capable, that you are worthy of me sparing your life, essentially. I feel like this is what should have happened in The Last of Us Part 2, but of course, I guess 7 years isn't long enough for some people who wrote the game, probably Neil Druckmann, to really think what would, you know, think of what would have been a good idea and what would have been a fucking terrible idea. But I just can't honestly, I cannot really comprehend the thought process of a lot of the writing that went into this game. Honestly, this is just, I just thought of this randomly. I was like, the Vinland Saga just seems like a much better exploration of this theme of the, the cycle of revenge and the, violence begets violence, all this kind of this sort of thing, but it does it so well, especially in comparison to something like The Last of Us Part 2. The Last of Us Part 2 just feels very surface level in its revenge plot, and sometimes that's fine. Like, you can have a very surface level revenge story, but with a game like The Last of Us, it seemed like it was trying to be this very narrative driven game with these very deep characters and these, fairly deep themes, and The Last of Us Part 2 just feels like such a step down from that, and of course, in a lot of ways, a betrayal of the characters that were in the first game because of how they're written completely differently. But I don't know. Do you guys want me to talk more about The Last of Us Part 2? Would you like to see more videos like this, where like I just go more in depth about the plot to the game and how they were basically just did some of the characters wrong in this game, and how it really doesn't even feel like a proper sequel to the first game. There's so much I really could rant about with Last of Us Part 2, because as a fan of the first game, I honestly feel like Part 2 just really pisses me off with a lot of what they did with the story. The gameplay really, from what I'm hearing and from what I've seen, isn't all that different from the first game. I mean, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But apparently this game is pretty long, and the gameplay just gets repetitive after a while, so I can definitely see how people would get tired of it. At some point, I feel like you do have to make some changes to the gameplay, or just do something different, but it just doesn't seem like they really tried to do that with Part 2. I mean, of course, visually the game looks incredible, but story-wise and to some extent gameplay-wise, it's just, well, especially just story-wise, it's a fucking disaster. In a narrative-driven game where you have a bad story, that's going to kill a lot of the interest for most people. Like, if it's a game that's like mostly reliant on its gameplay, that's one thing, but this is not that kind of game. So anyways, guys, what did you think of this comparison? Do you think there are other examples I could have brought up with Vinland Saga that I forgot about to compare to The Last of Us Part 2? What do you think is actually a good comparison with The Last of Us Part 2 and any other revenge story that just does the cycle of revenge theme better than this game? Let me know, and until next time, I will see you all later.